Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. Today, come from my home office. But today, we're going to, continue on chapter 3 and we're going to talk about immigration. So let's get into it. All right, immigration, straight up, pretty straightforward. Chapter 3, lesson 3. All right, that was your warm up. Objectives, you'll be able to identify the reasons for the resurgence of immigrants to the country, compare and contrast push and pull factors for new immigrants, and understand why nativists oppose immigration. All right, so where do they come from? So between 1865, following the end of the Civil War, and 1914, the beginning of World War I, 25 million people immigrated to the United States. 24 of those came from Europe. 1.3 came from Canada, 425,000 from Latin America, and 450,000 Asians. Some immigrants were pulled to the United States with the promise of opportunities. Other immigrants were pushed from their home countries by hardships that they were going through. So, pull factors, what brought them here. Also, push factors, what pushed them here as well. So here's a map, a rough estimate of numbers of where these new immigrants were coming from. So many European immigrants came to the United States because they were poor and American industries had plenty of jobs available. But that's not to say that Europe's industrial cities offered plenty of jobs too. So economic factors can't be the only sole reason to explain why people immigrated here. Many immigrants came to the United States to escape the restrictions of social class systems that kept them trapped at the bottom of society. No flexibility, no social mobility, allowing them to move from the bottom to the top, or even from the bottom to the middle. The poor working class to the middle class bourgeoisie. Others, though, left their homeland because of high rents, land shortages, or religious persecutions. Always that the freedom of religion here in America, that's a pull factor. So liberty, test question. Many European immigrants passed through the Ellis Island Inspection Center, the tiny island off in New York Harbor. Crowds of immigrants would file past doctors for an inspection. Those who failed an inspection, though, might be separated from their families and or returned back to Europe. About 12 million immigrants will pass through Ellis Island between 1892 and 1955. So there was Ellis Island back in its day. Looks very X-Men headquarter-ish. Here's some immigrants that were probably not allowed back. They didn't pass inspection. Some more lines. All right, new places. So by the late 1890s, more than half of all the immigrants entering the United States were from Eastern and Southern Europe, from places like Italy, Greece, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Serbia. Now, if you know any of those places, this time period, it kind of makes sense. This period of immigration to the United States is actually called the new immigration. The old immigration occurred obviously before 1890, and those immigrants were primarily coming from Northern and Western Europe. I've said this a couple times in class before. And if you don't know where these places are on a map, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Poland, Russia, Serbia, Greece, Italy. So like this half of the continent are all coming to the United States. All right, so jobs. Usually these immigrants, you had skilled Italian bricklayers and stonemasons contributed to the construction of many homes, churches, and buildings in American cities. Polish immigrants often became coal miners, meat packers, and steel workers. Jewish immigrants often worked in the garment industry or became merchants. And across all these ethnic groups, many will travel west to settle in the Great Plains as farmers and ranchers. So it wasn't just, these three. These are just examples of certain ethnicities and their jobs usually, what they usually came here to do. All right, the hood. So by the 1890s, immigrants made up a large percentage of the population in major cities like New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Detroit. Immigrants lived in neighborhoods that were often separated into ethnic groups as people settled near others from their homeland. So you have like Little Italy, Chinatown. You have the Jewish Lower East Side in New York City. Italians, Russians, and Jews were likely to stay near New York City, while large numbers of Germans, Swedes, and Poles moved to Midwestern cities like Milwaukee, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. The Irish, for example, settled in more of the Northeast and Upper Midwest and would become the largest ethnic group in Boston. So here you have Little Italy. I don't know if you can see, there is no real distinction. But trust me, I Googled it and this is the picture that showed up. Here you have the Lower East Side. I think that's Hebrew. No, it's not Hebrew. Don't quote me on that. Some more. This is in Boston. And of course, you have your cousin from Boston. Had to throw it in there. All right, changing the guard. American culture had been overwhelmingly Protestant, but that began to change in the late 1800s as immigrants brought their religion with them. By the early 1900s, Catholics actually made up 17% of the population and became the single largest religious denomination in the country. Orthodox Christians became more and more common with large Russian and Greek influx. There were mass persecutions in the late 1800s in Russia, Poland, and Romania, where many Eastern European Jews came to America. If you recall pogroms from Russian history, hopefully that might sound a little familiar. Pogroms are basically persecutions and discrimination towards Jews in Russia and most likely Eastern Europe. Not programs, pogroms. Most of the Jews lived in and around New York City and in Jewish communities all over the East Coast. And by the early 1920s, 2 million Jews lived in the United States. All right, so can't talk about one coast, got to talk about the other coast. In the mid-1800s, China was suffering from severe unemployment, poverty, famine, and the whole thing culminated with a civil war called the Taiping Rebellion. Those problems convinced tens of thousands of Chinese to head to the United States, and so too did California's gold rush. There was additional large influx of Japanese immigrants between 1900 and 1908 as Japan began building an industrial economy and an empire, which disrupted Japan's economy and will create hardships for its people. So here's a picture of the Taiping Rebellion, Taiping Heavenly Kingdom down here. Here's a very famous picture of Chinese railroad workers, or not railroad. They were also railroad workers, but they also came to get gold and get rich. So they were working with these gold rush pioneers. Here's some Japanese immigrants. All right, so Ellis Island on the East Coast, the Ellis Island of the West Coast, Angel Island, and mostly Chinese immigrants settled in West Coast cities, especially San Francisco. Many headed to the gold fields, but most failed to make much money, so they took jobs as servants and laborers. They'd also become merchants or skilled at a trade. Many helped build the Central Pacific Railroad. and part of the Transcontinental Railroad that connects this side to the other side. Initially, Angel Island was an inspection facility that was a 2-story shed on the wharf in San Francisco. So in 1910, California opened barracks on Angel Island for Asian immigrants inspections. Many were young men who nervously awaited the results of their immigration hearings in dorms packed with double or triple tiers of bunks, and any delay could last months to find out a response. So here's an example of the double or triple sided bunks. And that got me thinking, this looks a lot like Squid Games. Tell me I'm wrong. All right. So as more and more immigrants are coming to the country, the nativist thought reappears. So increased immigrants to the country will lead to more nativist sentiments among Americans. Nativism, again, is the extreme dislike of immigrants by native-born people. This came about in the 1840s and 50s against the Irish, but now in the late 1800s, nativists focused mainly on Asians, Jews, and Eastern Europeans. Many feared the large influx of, we're using that word a lot, influx of Catholic immigrants would swamp out the Protestant U.S. society. Oh no. And there were large amounts of Jewish immigrants that a lot of the beginnings of anti-Semitism were coming about in America. Anti-Semitism against Jews. So many labor unions actually argued that immigrants undermined the American workers because they would work for low wages and accept jobs as strike breakers. So they don't know of our ways and therefore they shouldn't work here, is really what nativists are thinking. Remember, nativists, basically, it's racism. And here's a very famous political cartoon. Again, I've said this in class, how a country built upon immigrants is so anti-immigrant in this time period, when here you have some rich people, right? And they're preventing a new immigrant coming to this country with everything on their back that they own. But in the shadows, okay, are the immigrants of their forefathers. So it's a little hypocritical, in my opinion. And hopefully you kind of see it too. Like, how are you going to stop someone who wants to make their life better when your lives were made better because of your ancestors who were immigrants? All right, anti-immigrant organizations. Increased nativist feelings will lead to the founding of 2 anti-immigrant organizations. The American Protective Association, founded in 1887, was anti-Catholic organization. Its members vowed not to hire or vote for Catholics and lobbied for restrictions of Catholic immigration to the United States. That's a little harsh, especially for a country that has freedom of religion. How are you going to know who's Catholic and who's not Catholic? The APA will build a large following in the Midwest and Northeast. And on the West Coast, there are strong sentiments against the Chinese that are going to lead to some violence. You have Dennis Kearney, an Irish immigrant, will form the Working Men's Party of California to fight against Chinese immigration. The party actually won seats in California's legislature and will make opposition to Chinese immigration a national issue. So you have laws, and this is the biggest one, in my opinion. The Congress will try to pass several laws to limit the number of immigrants to the United States, but most of these were vetoed by the presidents. However, now president at the time, Chester A. Arthur, will sign 2 bills that change this cycle. One of them, the biggest one, test question. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 will bar immigration for 10 years, Chinese immigration to the United States for 10 years, and prevented those in the United States from becoming citizens. So even if you came here for a better life and you came through the proper channels, the country will now not let your family come, first of all, to immigrate here. And you yourself cannot apply to become an immigrant, and you have to stay. Very interesting. It would be renewed in 1892, and then it would be made permanent in 1902. However, it wouldn't be repealed until, I think that's wrong. It should be 1943, 1942, same thing. So yeah, about 50 years, almost 50 years, 60 years of this. Pretty tough. History isn't always pretty. And then the other law that Chester A. Arthur signed was the Immigration Act of 1882, which imposed a head tax of 50 cents on each immigrant who arrived at the United States port, and gave immigration officials authority to reject immigrants who had criminal records, mentally disabled, or who were unable to take care of themselves. It would be a federal oversight and kind of a failure in the end, because it'll give responsibility to the Treasury Department to issue such regulations, to hire immigration agents, and to build inspection stations. But my guess is, where's this money? Who's this money coming from? Is the money coming from the immigrants, or is the money coming like from the people who are sending them, or the boats that are carrying the people? Like, who's paying these 50 cents? It's probably charging 50 cents for immigrants to pay up. Let's look up, what is 50 cents? Sorry, this is totally against 50 cents in 1882 money. That's $50. I want 50 cents. Hold on. 0.50. Uh, 15 cent. About $16. 50 cents back then was about $15. So that's you put it there. This law will, however, trigger a debate on how to regulate immigration, and it still continues to be a problem. Obviously, limiting immigration or allowing it to happen. So here you have some anti-Chinese political cartoons. The Golden Gate of Liberty, obviously San Francisco. Notice communist, nihilist, socialist, Fenian, and hoodlum welcome, but no admittance to the Chinaman. And look what the Chinaman is sitting on. He brings bags of industry, order, sobriety, and peace, and he's barred. But a communist, a socialist, a hoodlum could be welcome here. And here you have, it says, Uncle Sam kicking out, the Chinese must go. I think this says the magic washer. Don't use this, or if you want to be dirty. So very interesting. I'm trying to look at what the picture says. That's why my face is so cool. So it's basically a machine that washes your clothes, and Uncle Sam is kicking out the immigrants who are washing their clothes by hand. Seems a little rude. And boom, quickness, quick-witted. Yeah, that was a very short lecture. Very short section in your textbook as well. So without further ado, your homework is page 151, 2 through 4. So hopefully you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.